Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are live here for a second time talking about the French Revolution. So I've got like a jam-packed session for you guys. I have 8 pages of notes, and we're just going to go over the full timeline of the French Revolution from 1789 to 1795. So let's begin. This revolution, most authors agree, starts with the summoning of the General Estates on May 5th, 1789. And so the king, as you might have learned from my last live, was struggling, especially on the economy. And so what he did is he summoned 1,200 members of the three estates, the clergy, nobility, and the third estate, to discuss the economy. And so, a breakdown of these, there were 600 members of the Third Estate. Of course, the Third Estate being 98% of the population, and then there were 300 of the clergy and 300 of the nobility. But honestly, the Third Estate had even more representation because much of the Second Estate, the clergy was parish priests or monks, which lived with the lived with the third estates, and so all of these members wrote up what we call cahiers de doléances, or grievances of their people. And what is actually surprising is I was reading this author, and they were saying that even between the three estates, there was great unanimity. Most of them most of them saw that this was an uncontrolled government, and they wanted to establish a constitution, and they wanted the general states to meet regularly. Most of them agreed that the general states should vote on taxes and that actually everyone should pay, because in the old regime it was mostly only the third estate that paid. But it's quite surprising that even the representatives of the nobility saw that it was that to keep this system they had to reduce the inequalities. And so here's a little quote here from Charles Downer Hazen. It said, "The clergy and nobility almost unanimously agreed in their cahier to relinquish their exemptions for which they had fought so resolutely only 2 years before. On the other hand, the Third Estate was willing to see the continuance of the nobility with its rights and honors. The Third Estate demanded the suppression of feudal dues. There was in their cahier no hint of a desire for a violent revolution. They all expressed a deep affection for the king, gratitude for his summoning of the State General, faith that the worst was over, that now in a union of all hearts a way would easily be discovered out of the unhappy plight in which the nation found itself." But of course, we all know that that's not what happened. And so, what really did happen? Well, on May 5th, the king and his finance minister both made a long speech. But the problem was, especially in the finance minister's speech and the king's speech, they didn't answer the main questions the estate general had. And one of these main questions was whether they were going to vote by estate or by head. And so, voting by estate, it would be that the first estate as a whole would have one vote, the second estate as a whole would have one vote, and the third estate as a whole would have one vote. Well, the third estate found this very unequal because they represented basically 98% of the population, and so they wanted it to be a vote by head. And so what happens is the finance minister Necker has this great speech, and he talks mostly about the financial situation of the kingdom. and he doesn't really talk about a political program or reference any key issue of voting. And so on May 6th, the first two estates gather separately by estates and start the verification of their members. But the third estates, seeing how this would ultimately lead to a vote by estates, refuse to do so until the king or his finance minister respond to their question. And by by doing this, the state general is blocked, and they don't do anything for basically a month until the 10th of June, where the third estate, call once more for the two other estates to join them. And when that doesn't happen on June 17th, they proclaim themselves the National Assembly. And so at first it's mostly the third estate, and the king on June 20th decides to lock them out of their building, and that's when you get this famous painting of the proclamation of the tennis courts, where they decide to go into a tennis court and proclaim never to not separate until they have made a constitution. And so the king, seeing this, decides finally to yield, and the 9th of July, um, he proclaims it to be an actual representative of the government. And at that point, many of the second estate and a minority of the first estate decide and join the assembly. But there's still fear that the king is gonna try to close down the assembly again. And when he, in fact, um, starts putting troops around Paris and Versailles, this fear becomes a real threat. And so, and plus, on July 11th, he dismisses the popular finance minister Necker. And so the people of Paris, fearing the guards, decide to arm themselves. And so on July 14th, they decide to raid the Invalides, a place where there were many guns. But now they have many guns, but they don't have any gunpowder. And so they decide to go against the Bastille. And this is the famous Prise de la Bastille. And so they surround it. The governor of the Bastilles tries to hold them down for a bit, negotiating, but in the end, they win. And I believe even after, like a few weeks after they conquer the Bastille, they decide to rip it to the ground. And so the news of this event, the news of the people of Paris going against the system, because the Bastille was really a symbol for the oppression of those days. With there was major works entitled, I think there was one entitled the something the Bastille, and it really gave this prison a horrible aspect. And so this news of the events of Paris spread mass fear all around France, and this is where you get the mass terror of July, where all over France the um the citizens go against their local nobles, and for the most part they burn the archives of feudal rights. And so these mass events cause there to be um, the nights of the 3rd and 4th August, where the National Assembly decides to abolish feudal rights. So here's a little quote again from Charles Downer Hazen, who really puts this perfectly. All night long, the excitement continued amid tears, embraces, rapture, applause, a very ecstasy of patriotic abandonment. And by 8 in the morning, 30 decrees more or less had been passed, and the most extraordinary social revolution that any nation has known had been voted. Tithes were abandoned, the guilds with the narrow restrictions were swept away. No longer were offices to be purchasable, but henceforth all Frenchmen were to be equally eligible to all public positions. Justice was to be free. Provinces and individuals were all to be the same on the same plane. Distinctions of class were abolished. The principle of equality was henceforth to be the basis of the state. And so that was that. And the problem with this was that, yes, they passed many decrees banning feudal rights, but as we will see, these actually lingered up until around 1793. And so now after this, on the 26th of August, 1789, was um, voted the Declaration of Human Rights, probably the most major documents on human rights ever published, and of course, the first main one. And so this document had around 40 offers, and it marked the symbolic death of the ancient regime. It's abolished the abuses of the judicial arbitrariness and unequal taxation, and in a new conception of sovereignty based on national representation. So the king at first actually didn't sign on these decrees because he feared that they went against the nobility and the clergy. And so the assembly tried to persuade him, giving him a veto power, but he still didn't sway until on October 4th or 5th, there were a massive protest started in Paris by women where thousands of them walked all the way to Versailles and demanded that the king sign these declarations. And they also brought the king and the parliaments back to Paris. And so, with this, you then have the civil constitution of the clergy. And for me, this is the first misstep of the revolution. For until now, they were proclaiming freedom, liberty for all, but with this civil constitution, it's the complete opposite. They start restricting what people can believe. And so on July 12th, 1790, they signed the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, which states that all clergymen must take an oath to the Republic. I believe that out of the 136 bishops, only 4 decide to take this oath because the Pope had restricted it, and I believe it was only 1/3 of the parish priests decided to take up this oath. And this is where you really see the contrast at the beginning, where in the second estate, around 200 of the 300 parish priests that were in the general estates were more for the third estate, and here were only 1/3 of them decide actually to take this oath. And so this has the consequence of starting the years long counter revolutions, especially in the Vendée, as we shall just see. And what you've got to realize is it's not like today. The church back then was the essential part um of the farmer's life, of almost everybody's life. And so this civil constitution, which restricted what the church could do, um, did not please much of the population of France. And so, because of this, you get counter revolutions. And the major one, started by the civil constitution of the clergy, was in Vendée. And so, you have multitudes of the lower clergymen turn against the revolutionaries. And before then, the only real counter revolutions were some nobles, but they had no populace behind them. And after this civil constitution of the clergy, thousands joined their ranks. And even after this, the legislative decide to go to war, as we shall see, and so they put up conscription. And this too, much like the Constitution, turns multitudes of thousands of people against the revolution. And so, up until this point, everything was seeming good, apart from the counter revolutions. With this revolution, the king seemed on board with the plan, and even on July 14th, 1790, they had a party declaring the revolution to be good. That is until the king tries to escape. And so the king was confined to Paris. He was not allowed to leave. There was a decree that made it so he couldn't leave the vicinity of Paris, and also on occasion, a mob didn't let him go to, I believe, this sermon made by this preacher uh, someplace. And so one night, June 20th, 1791, he decides to disguise himself as a valet and the queen, a Russian lady, and they decide to reach the fortress of Montmédy, which is actually now inside of France, but I believe at the time it was part of the Holy Roman Empire, to meet up with General Bouillet, to regroup a force, and to then go back to Paris and take over. Well, that's all seems pretty nice, but he actually made it pretty far. He made it to the village of Varennes, which, if you know a little bit of French geography, is he basically arrived at the destination and got caught right on time. And so this is where you first see major anti um you see major works of major Republicans coming up from this. And even the Jacobins, as we shall see just ahead, decide to sign a petition to get rid of the king. And so, yeah, let's get right to that. And what you've got to understand about the French Revolution is, in the Legislative Assembly, unlike today, there weren't real political groups. It was mostly a foment of different clubs, which had a party line, and then these clubs would split up and form other clubs, and there were popular figures which people would surround, and that would kind of create a club. And so the main club at the time was the Jacobin Club, and it started in 1789 as the Society of the Friends on the Constitution. And as we shall see, and you probably know, the most influential leader was Robespierre. And this club started up as a big party tent in encompassing everybody who wasn't for the monarchy. And so at the beginning, in the Legislative Assembly, on the right, you had all those who were in favor of the king, a lot of nobles, some priests, and some of the Third Estate too. And so this Jacobin club decided to form to kind of counter that. And so at the beginning, it was a big party of people. I believe it had around 200 to 300 members of the assembly were a part of this club, and uh, it later became the mountain, but we'll see that a little later. And so then you have the Feuillants, and the Feuillants split from the Jacobin Club when this one, as we had said before, decide to sign a petition that that says they want to replace King Louis XVI and either make him regnant, which means he's they wanted to make I think they wanted to make his son king, or they wanted to make his cousin king. And so the Feuillants, who were part of this big party tent, but were still kind of more with the king, decide to split off, and they form the group in 1791, and they have a lot of power 1791 to 1792 until we'll see August 10th, 1792. And so this creates this is a schism in the Jacobin Club, and the Feuillants were more. So now you had, after this schism, you had the Feuillants regrouping a little bit with the monarchists to have on the right of the assembly. Then in the middle, you had the plain. And on the left and far left, you had the Jacobin Club, well, what's rest of it. And then you had the Girondists, the Iberistes, and the Cordelier Club. So the Girondists were southwestern deputies, like I believe, yes, Brissot and Mrs. Roland. Mrs. Roland wasn't the deputy, but she had, I believe, her husband was a deputy, and she had a cafe and was a very influential person. But we'll talk more about them later. And so then you had Iberistes, which were also affiliated. We'll just group them all to one. They were affiliated with the Sans-Culottes and the Commune, which we'll talk about more, the Exagérés, and the Enragés. And so this group formed in 1792 and were basically, let's not lie here, a communist mob, a communist revolutionary mob before communism existed. They believed in the ends justify the means. They controlled newspapers. They were less in the assembly, but they controlled newspapers. Hébert, it was really a cult of personality around Hébert, which was who had a pamphlet, I believe. I don't know if it's called a pamphlet, but a letter called Le Père du Jeunesse. And they were in big with de-Christianization of France, which they eventually did when they got into power. And so lastly, you had the Cordelier Club, which were more radical than the Jacobin Club at the beginning, because remember, the Jacobin Club was a big, tense. The Cordelier Club was concentrated in Paris, where the Jacobin Club had, I think, around 2,000 lodges all around the big cities and even the villages of France, and was a really connected system. I've marked it right here, a state within the states. But the Cordelier Club was centralized in Paris, and it was a hotbed for republicanism, as we said, after the failed attempt of the king. And he had the leader of this club, called Danton. And so after this, you get the War of the First Coalition. And the first thing that's got to be said about the War of the First Coalition is that basically everyone in the assembly wanted a war. I believe there was only around 9 people. I might be wrong. You might have to fact check me about this, but basically everybody wanted the war. And the Jacobins wanted the far left wanted the war because they thought it would unmask the king as a traitor to the revolution, and the people more close to the king thought it would have the opposite effect, giving Louis more power when he would be victorious in a battle or something like that. And so it all starts when the French legislature decides to sign a decree saying that all émigrés, which were the nobles who fled from France, especially after the July events, these émigrés would lose their territories if they did not come back in a couple of weeks. And so Francis, the king of Austria at that time, sends a letter back, basically saying that they needed to restore the feudal rights to the princes and lords of Alsace-Lorraine, because Alsace-Lorraine had signed this agreement with the king decades before. And he also said that that's about it. So, with this, the assembly ends up voting for war on April 20th, 1792. And so, as I said here, almost everyone was for it. Interestingly, except Robespierre, which I find quite interesting, because Robespierre, we always think of this guy as a bloodthirsty revolutionary, but it seems at the beginning he was way less radical than some of his counterparts like Danton, which Danton was full for war. And so what happens is Austria first goes into war, and they have colonies, and I think they control Holland at the time. And then Prussia declares war on France quite right after. And I believe the Duke of Brunswick, which I don't know if he's part of Prussia or the Holy Roman Empire, but he writes a manifesto. And this guy is probably the dumbest person in the whole revolution. He writes a manifesto, and basically it orders the inhabitants of Paris to restore King Louis to his full power, and it says that if they dare harm, I'm paraphrasing here, but if they dare harm a hair on King Louis's head or on the head of any of his family members, he would burn Paris to the ground. And so, of course, you can understand what happened. They burned the inhabitants of Paris decided to attack the king. And so, on August 10th, the morning of August 10th, a sans-culotte revolutionary mob attack the Palace des Tuileries, where the king is living with his family. The king and his family fled to the assembly, and he actually orders his officers not to shoot on the crowd, but they disobey, and so in the ensuing events, 5,000 people are killed, and the Swiss Guard are overwhelmed, and the whole Tuileries Palace is sacked and absolutely destroyed. So, this one event that takes place in Paris pressures the Legislative Assembly, which is supposed to represent all of France, into taking action. And they suspend the king's powers and lock him in a nearby prison along with his wife and children. Just think about that. The French power was so centralized in Paris, even though it was supposed to represent all of France, because all of France, most of France, was highly, if not monarchical, they were highly favorable to the king and the Catholic Church. And just because of these few events of radical people in Paris, the assembly wipes out the king's powers, and as we will see later, declares France a republic. And so, again, this revolutionary mob in September, just a few weeks later, seeing the Austrian and Prussian forces creeping slowly into France, fear and up that they will release the prisoners of in the prisons of France. And so, what do they decide to do? Well, they decide over the course of a few days to massacre the priests and the émigrés held in those prisons. And so, a few hundred priests and nobles are in prison, fearing, are killed, fearing an uproar of counter revolutionary action. And after a decisive victory in the war, the convention proclaims the Republic of France the 22nd of September 1792. And so, with this new proclamation, they decide to um, get another election going. And so, the Feuillon, which had most of the power, completely disappear. Some of its members, of course, stay, but they join other clubs or factions. And so now you have the Jacobins and their allies completely in control of the governments. But what happens is now there's a split, another split in the Jacobin club. And so there's now the Brissotins or the Girondists surrounding Brissot and the Montagnards with leaders like Robespierre, Marat, and Danton. So, of course, these two factions were entirely devoted to the Republic, and they were in agreement on many things. The Girondins, or Girondists, were less radical than their co-deputies. They distrusted and disliked frequent appeals to force, while the Montagnards, on the other hand, were more rude, active, forceful, and indifferent to the law, if the law stood in their way. Of course, we already said Montagnard had three, leaders: Robespierre, Marat, which who was a emphatic writer championing revolutionary violence against the king and death to the opponents of the republic. And then there was Danton, as I said, a war enthusiast, but by now less radical, and we'll see later, than the two other his two other people. And so, and to quote Hazen, he was the spirit of easygoing compromise, but the Girondists, to their own failings, would not cooperate with him. And so, what you see here is at first you have the big party Jacobin Club and the monarchists on the other side, and then this left, because they were at the left, they split, and now part of that goes to the right, and another part stays on the left, and then the part on the right gets washed away again, and again the parts on the left of the assembly, I'm talking about the assembly, splits, and one of the parts go to the right. And so you get an ever more radicalization of the assembly. And we'll see once more it happens again. The people on the right, the Girondists this time, get wiped out by the Montagnards. And so for the first, from 19, no, sorry, not 19, 1792, the Girondists have most of the power. And again, of course, there's the Plaine or the centrists, the constitutionalists in between them. But they have most of the power for, I believe, the next round 6 to 8 months. And so then you get the execution of Louis the 16th. At first, the Jacobins didn't even want a trial. They just wanted a vote from the commune, not the commune, the convention, as it's now called, instead of any kind of sort of trial. But in the end, he does get a trial, but in front of a jury which had just weeks ago stripped him of his royalty. His jury was the assembly. So the trial lasted about a month with Louis himself answering questions. But once this iron chest that was actually built, handmade by Louis Capet, was found, it was pretty much a done deal. This iron chest held communications between him and Francis and other enemies of France. And so once they found this, there was kind of no point of having a trial. And so the first vote to find the former king guilty of conspiracy against France was a overwhelming yes. I believe everybody except 24 people, everybody voted yes, 0 people voted no, and around 24 people abstained from the vote. But the second and more important vote was the vote on what punishment he should have. And this one was much, much more closer. So, in the votes, 721 of the deputies voted, each going on the stage and pronouncing their votes. In the end, there were there were 4 main groups. There were those for an unconditional death. There were those who wanted death, but with certain conditions. There's another one that wanted death with reprisals, so a delay, and there's others that just wanted confinements or even expulsion of the French territory. And so the vote went as follows: 361 for death, 26 with conditions, 44 with reprisals, so death with reprisals, death with conditions, and 290 with 290 for confinements, or I believe it's called confinement. And so at the end, the 26 was added to the 361, and so for death was 387, and against death or for delay was 334. That is surprisingly close when you see that for a majority they had to have 361. That is pretty crazy. And so the king is executed on, I believe, January 16th. Oh, no, it's January 21st, as you can see in this image I put behind on the screen. So, with the execution of Louis the 16th, or Louis Capet, and the assembly being split between the Montagnards and the Girondins, a new power group or adversary came into play: the Commune. And the Commune was the government of Paris, I believe a parliament itself, but it was also a sort of mob controlled by key figures like Hébert and Marat. So at the beginning, the Commune was more on the side of the Jacobins, and that was one of the first major split in the convention, was on the subject of what they should do about the people who facilitated and engaged in the massacre of September. And the Girondins wanted to punish them, the Girondists didn't. And of course, the facilitators in that massacre was mostly the Commune. And so the Girondins were even able to send Marat in front of the Revolutionary Tribunal, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this failed for the Revolutionary Tribunal, were most favorable to him. And so, and it ended up actually radicalizing him even further against now even supporters of the Republic, the Girondists. And so the Commune, who loved and idealized both Marat and Robespierre, intervenes in the struggle in their usual way, by by physical force. And to quote 1,000 men with 60 cannons, the convention was the prisoner of the commune, the government of France at the mercy of the government of Paris. The commune demanded the expulsion of the Girondist leaders from the convention. The convention protested indignantly against the conduct of the insurgents. But in the end, the convention ended up giving in and voting the arrest of 29 Girondists, many of them deputies. And so, seeing the power slip into the hands of the government of Paris, the Girondists call the departments to arms, and many of them do turn to arms, and this is called the Federalist counter-revolutions, which were not really revolutions against the Republic, but more for it, because the Girondists were also for the Republic. And so the deputies of the convention wanting to show, and this was even the Jacobins, wanting to show that they did not need to fear a dictatorship of the government of Paris, decided to write up a constitution that decentralized the power at such a point that it was basically unmanageable. Every single law that was voted by the convention had to be ratified by a majority of the French citizenship. It also established universal male suffrage. But the problem, and it was ratified, this constitution was ratified by an overwhelming majority. I believe it was something like 2 million people voted yes to like barely 40,000 who voted no, or something even more crazy. But the problem was, it was voted, I believe, on July 1793, and they suspended the Constitution in August 1793, saying it would be reinstated. It wouldn't be reinstated until peace. And this was, of course, it was suspended by the Jacobins. And so this is where the tyranny really begins. First, the Committee of Public Safety. I've got a lot to say on the Committee of Public Safety. One second. So, this committee was an executive, just like you have the most like president or prime minister in most countries today. They had a Committee of Public Safety of 9, then 12, and I believe at the end 11 members. And they had 9 or 12 members so that they wouldn't get a tyranny, but what happened was they still got a tyranny. And so it was created by Danton on April 6, 1793, and the members were chosen by the convention each month, but they didn't really differ. The members didn't really differ because they voted on the same people every single time. And it was the main organ of the revolutionary governments. At first, it was in charge of the foreign affairs, but it became all-encompassing, dictating every facet of the states, and even the convention itself, which was supposed to elect them, but in the end, it was the committee who really was in control of the convention. And so they worked night and day, setting up mattresses by their desks, and they listened to reports, framed decrees, and appointed officials. And below them, the Gestapo, basically, the NKVD, the secret, not really secret, but the police, the people who reinforced the decrees set by by the Committee of Public Safety, was the Committee of General Security. So, I believe there also were 2 deputies who would go to each department and who also acted as a sort of police themselves, but this was the main branch. And so this was the enforcement arm of the Committee of Public Safety, would make sure decrees and laws made by them and voted by the convention were fully respected and followed. And as I said, they were basically the version of the Nazi Gestapo or the version of the Soviet NKVD. And they could basically put anybody they wanted into prison, bringing back the abolished letters of not letters of mark, but some sort of letter. And so then you get the third um, organ of this tyranny, the Revolutionary Tribunal. There was the first one created on August 17th, 1792, which was a preliminary revolutionary tribunal. But the main one was created on March 10th, 1793, again at Danton's suggestion. This was a criminal court, but not the usual criminal court. This was, and even at its preliminary stages, it was crazy. So, just to name a few things, its purpose was to try traitors and conspirators rapidly. So whenever you get the word rapidly in courts, you know you're going to get tyrannical stuff. No appeal could be made on its judgments. Its judgments was either not guilty or to the guillotine. And what else is there? Oh yes, and then the law of the 22nd Periel made it even worse. But we'll talk about that a little bit. And here's a quote that really showcases the tyranny of this tribunal. A man might be informed at 10 o'clock that he was to appear before the Revolutionary Tribunal at 11. By 2 o'clock, he was sentenced. By 4, he was executive. This was a machine. So then, facilitating all this was the law of suspects, a decree voted by the Assembly and passed on September 17th, 1793. And let me just read to you quickly. You can find it on internet, but I'll just read to you quickly this decree. So Article 1. Immediately after the publication of the present decree, all suspected persons who are found within the territory of the Republic and who are still at liberty shall be placed under arrest. Article 2. All deemed suspected persons, so Article 1 said that all suspected persons will be placed under arrest, and so Article 2 is showing us who these suspected persons are. So 1, those who either by their conduct, their associations, their words, or their writings have shown themselves supporters of tyranny or federalism and enemies of liberty. 2, those who cannot justify in the manner prescribed by the law of the 21st March last their means of existence in the fulfillment of their civic duties. 3, those who have been refused certificates of civism. And it goes on, I believe, 6 different points of how you can be a suspect. Right, one second. And then there's, excuse me, uh 10 other articles through 3 through 10, and reading these, the only restriction it has is on the how they can throw these people in prison is, I believe, uh Article 4, yes. Members of the committee may not order the arrest of any individuals unless they are at least 7 in number and unless there is an absolute majority in votes. So the only restriction on why a public official representing the government could not throw you in prison is that they had to be 7 and they had to agree by a majority. And let's just reread the first points of that article. It says those who either by their conduct, so your action, the associations, so it might not even be that you have any thoughts of counter-revolution. Maybe you just know the guy who has thoughts of counter-revolution. Now, because you associated with that guy, you can be thrown into trial, to prison. So, associations, their words, their writings, have shown themselves supporters of tyranny or federalism and enemies of liberty. Enemies of liberty. That is extremely vague. Enemies of liberty. It could be basically everything. Because who defines what liberty is? So, this whole thing was just a law so that the state could imprison anyone they deemed they wanted to. And so with this, you also get the atrocious response to the counter revolutions. Here's another quote here. The convention passed a fierce resolution. The city of Lyon is to be destroyed. Every house which was inhabited by the rich shall be demolished. There will remain only the homes of the poor, of patriots, and buildings especially employed for industries, and those edifices dedicated to humanity and to education. So the convention was basically saying you can go destroy Lyon because Lyon was in counter-revolution. I believe maybe under the control of the British, but that might be Marseille. And of course, they didn't end up destroying every house, thankfully, but they did destroy a few. And one of the craziest places was Vendée. And so the convention sent out this guy named Carrier, and he was a massacre. And he wasn't like the revolution in Paris where they pretended to have a trial and then they executed you. No, this guy would shoot tens of people at a time in squads. He shot, he killed 2,000, and he would also place people on boats and then sink the boats in La Loire. Now, La Loire is a massive river, and he drowned so many people in that river that it was poisoned for some time. Poisoned. And this is not like a little tiny stream or anything. This is the biggest river in France. So yeah, pretty crazy. In the end, I believe the convention found him guilty of war crimes, and he also was executed. But he massacred thousands of people in Vendée, and there's even a sort of amusement park, historical park in Vendée called Le Puy de Fou. And if you guys have ever been to there, and if you ever go to France, it's a really cool park. They have a bunch of animations about what happens, and it's pretty crazy. And so with this and all these revolutions, you get the beginning of the terror. Heads start flying. And so the first to go were the émigrés and the non-juring priests. And then came the Giondistes, the ones who were called by the convention, and among them were prominent members like Madame Roland, and there was also, and what's interesting is during this time, all the people who were the at the forefront of the revolution in 1789, people like le Duc d'Orléans, like Mirabeau, like Condorcet. I believe Condorcet wasn't executed, but um, he fled from execution. All these people who were at the forefront of this glorious, as they called it, revolution were now being executed and called traitors to the revolution. So that's how you really see the radicalization of this revolution. And so, as I said, the Queen was executed, Duc d'Orléans was executed, and Madame Roland was executed. I believe Brissot might have been executed. I'm not sure though. And then it goes farther. Oh, before that, sorry. Then you get the creation of a new religion, and this is a creation of the commune, which is basically in power right now because they suspended the constitution that decentralized it, so it really nothing happened. The commune was in power, and the commune under Hébert put forth its plan of de-Christianization. And so they created a new calendar, started at the year of the proclamation of the Republic, 22nd of September, 1792. And he replaced, if not destroyed, all the churches, not all of them, but most of the churches, especially in Paris and in big cities, with temples of reason. And so reason, and I believe the deists of reason was worshipped. And they had all these ceremonies, and they had their new calendar. And it was funny thing, watchmakers were now had to put like 4 different um, arrows on their watch so that people could differentiate from the old time and the new time, because it wasn't just a calendar. They also rewrote time. I believe it was in sets of 10. So there was like 10 seconds in a minute, 100 minutes an hour, 10 days in a month, or something like that, 10 days in a week. And so, yeah, heaven were no more. The churches were either destroyed or turned into temples of reason. And now let's talk about the rise of Robespierre. And Robespierre has kind of been lurking either in the background or surrounded by other people, not fully in control yet. But now he's going to be. And so you had 3 factions. Now that the Girondists were out of the way, had basically no power, the Jacobins were in control. But they wasn't only the Jacobins. As I said before, there was 3 leaders. There was Marat, who had been assassinated, kind of replaced by Hébert. And you had Danton, and you had Robespierre. And so Danton, at this point, really wanted to calm down all of the massacring. He believed that they had gotten rid of most of the enemies. They just start toning it down so that it wouldn't become all crazy. And so because of that, Robespierre had him executed on April 5th, 1794. But before that even, he decided to execute Hébert, so that Hébert, who was really the head of the commune, and so he got the convention, I believe, to vote for his arrest and execution. And because Hébert fled, I believe they killed him on the spot without trial. Because if they would have passed him through the Revolutionary Tribunal, I believe, much like Marat, they would not have executed him. But he fled, and so they kind of executed him on the spot on March 13th, 1794. And so now with these 2 leaders out of the way, Robespierre was basically emperor. This is where the real terror begins. Robespierre is now in control, and one of the first things, not one of the first things he does, one of the major things he does is the law of the 22nd Prairial, or on June 10th, 1794. And so before then, the Revolutionary Tribunal, in the 14 months, remember that number, 14 months, had executed 1,251 people. And now, after the law of the 22nd of Prairial, how it's called, in the 6 weeks it had, from June 10th to July 27th, it executed 1,376 people. Just think about that. 14 months, 1,250. 6 weeks, 1,376 people. And so what did this second law of Prairial do? Well, it abolished a defense counsel, so the accusers were no longer given a lawyer. It denied the use of witnesses if the judge, I believe, something ridiculous, like the judge had a certain thought that there wasn't needed of one. And any opposition to the government was punishable death. The jury was purged of anybody who was only lukewarm of Robespierre. So the whole jury was purged, and well, you see the results. And so now a person could be sent to this tribunal by the convention, the Committee of Public Safety, the Committee of General Security, or merely a prosecutor. And so, in addition to that, he created his new religion, much influenced by the writings of Rousseau, which he was admire, ad, admired. The cult of the supreme being, and there's a funny clip if you guys know oversimplified. I'm not going to show it here, but you guys can look it up. Where it's pretty funny because the cult of the supreme being, and basically he's calling himself the supreme being. And so finally, his reign of power ends on July 27th, 1794. And here's a quick quote which nicely recaps the situation. The storm broke on July 27th, 1794, when Robespierre attempted to speak in the convention, which had cowered under him, and at his demand had indelibly debased itself by passing the infamous law of Prairial. He was shouted down. Cries of "Down with the tyrant" were heard, attempting to rouse the people in the galleries. He this time met with no response. The magic was gone. There was a confused, noisy struggle lasting several hours. Robespierre's voice failed him. Danton's blood is choking him, exclaimed one of the conspirators. Finally, the convention voted his arrest and that of his satellites, his brother, Saint Just, and Coffin. And so, with that, the reign of Robespierre was done. And with that, that's where I am cutting off the revolution. Some authors cut it up at the December 2nd, 1799. But after that, you get the continuance of the convention, and then you get that directory, and it's really not that important. Not that much passes. And so the question is, why did I, and why are we here exploring the French Revolution? And well, the reason is that there's so much information about it. There's so many aspects you can look. And I've read books that are more in favor of the revolution. I've read books that were more against it. And there's so many different points of view, so many things happening in these short 4 years, 5 years, excuse me. That's the question is, what is the truth? Was this revolution just a uprising of the people against tyranny, against the oppression, for liberty, or was there something more sinister going on? People at the top kind of controlling it, kind of moving it towards for their incentives. What was actually happening? And so I wanted to do these first two live streams. The first one exploring the why the revolution happened, and the second one's exploring what happens in a more of a mainstream look to get a nice base of understanding to build upon this and explore other ideas. I was reading the book Pawns in the Game. If anybody, you can find it in a PDF. It's a really good read. You can also find it on YouTube, an audiobook that I did myself. Um, and there was a chapter on the French Revolution. He was proposing a bunch of ideas that I hadn't heard about before, and some ideas sounded pretty legitimate. So I wanted to really understand because I've you guys have probably too. I've learned about the French Revolution multiple times in schools, and there's of course this mainstream thing that's pushed. And so I'm gonna for the following live streams, I'm going to explore different ideas posited by different authors who have a different um, view of the revolution, and we're going to see if these stand up or if they crumble, and really get to the bottom of what happened here. So yeah, with that, it's been a good hour, and I thank you for watching. Until the next time, see you.